Hey everybody. So as promised, the inaugural Resistance Recovery YouTube channel discussion with one Charles Shaw. I've been looking forward to this. I thought he would be the ideal guy to start with. I think you'll see why. Kind of touches all the bases. And away we go.
Nice to be here.
A few of my people know who you are, a lot of them don't. So maybe just a little intro from you.
Okay. What's the easiest way to phrase this? I am 50 years old, and for the past 30 years, I have primarily been a writer across pretty much the entire spectrum. I was trained at Boston University. I have a degree in literature and creative writing, a minor in psychology. I have written for the movie industry, for the theater industry, for the advertising industry, for the public relations industry, for the legal industry. I was an investigative journalist. Then I was published author with Exile Nation, which was published in 2012. I have also directed and produced 5 feature-length documentaries, a number of shorts, and a number of videos. And I also have a number of presentations on my YouTube channel as well that cover generally what we'd like to call, deep political analysis. And there's a whole series I did back in 2012 called Consciousness and Revolution, which is pretty meaty. And I gave about 6 versions of that talk around the world that year. So most of them are up on my YouTube account. I also have a Vimeo account under Nomad Cinema. That's my production company. But for much of the last 5 years, I've been shifting out of the media industry and focusing really deeply on entheogens, on healing trauma and substance use disorder with entheogenic medicine, and a lot of companion therapies. I worked for 3 different ibogaine clinics in Mexico, and I now have a consulting practice where I help people recover from all sorts of serious mental health crises. I think that's probably a fair summary.
Okay. So just how did you wind up here?
Right, that's a great question. And I should also probably add that I was a political organizer for many years. I was an official with the Green Party of the United States. I primarily sat in a couple of chairmanships during the Bush years and during the war in Iraq. My protest career kind of started with the battle in Seattle and the WTO movement, and went through the Bush administration. And I would say I probably walked away from that once Obama was elected, and then I kind of threw myself into the Burning Man world as a producer there and at Boom Festival for about 7 or 8 years. So that was a fun little detour. But interwoven with that was all the media work, and then also an ongoing relationship with entheogenic medicine, psychedelic emergency medicine, psychedelic healing, because of my relationship to the MAPS organization. I was involved with or ran 3 of the different theme camps that MAPS would set up at Burning Man in order to run the Zendo project, which in my day was called the Sanctuary. And it was a psychedelic emergency sanctuary for people that were having difficult psychedelic experiences, as we say in the lingo. And then I also worked for Boom Festival because of our relationship with a group of visionary artists, and that was part of our collective in Fractal Nation and in Entheon Village. So anybody who's got Burning Man in their history probably has heard all of those names, along with Red Lightning and Shift Camp and these others that I ended up producing over the years. So, yeah, I've been around a little bit.
Was the interest in with the entheogens and trauma there from the get-go?
No,
Or no?
I was a hard sell. I would say I did the typical middle class white, you know, exploration of psychedelics in college, which usually amounts to little more than LSD, mushrooms, and MDMA for most people, or at least in my day, that was kind of like
Yeah.
the traditional, you know, thing. I wasn't really that thrilled about them. I mean, I had some fun with it, but not much. And then there was a 15-year gap where I didn't have any. So it was right around the time that I became, you know, I guess we can say officially or formally aware that I had post-traumatic stress disorder, that I also began my very long-term relationship with the MAPS organization, the Entheon Village Collective, and that group was my entree into the psychedelic healing world. And it was some of those people in that collective and in that organization that first suggested that I might try some of their, you know, therapies. Although we have to understand this was 2002, 3, 4. So this was, you know, many years before MAPS had their war chest, you know, of big donors, and was able to really push their media campaign, which was, you know, very strong in 2011, 12, 13, 14, where, you know, every time you would turn on the news or something, you would see Rick Doblin talking, you know, about MDMA for PTSD and the veteran pilot study and the FDA study. Well, this was all before any of that stuff had come along. So you couldn't, you know, you had to kind of know these folks to know the therapeutic angle and realize that you could talk to people that understood both, you know, how to recover from trauma and also how to utilize these medicines in the process.
Right.
So I was very resistant at first. I was, you know, I had a lot of the very kind of run-of-the-mill fears of you know, I might lose my mind, you know, I might not never come back. I don't want to relive all of my traumas, you know, all of these kind of standard tropes that people that are in the position I was in, which is, you know, I had both acute PTSD from, you know, violence and, you know, crack addiction and prison and all of these things. But then I also had the complex form of it, you know, which is still hovering around official validation. It hasn't been put in the DSM yet. So, you know, people are kind of on the fence about it, but
Sure.
I'm, you know, one of those in the camp that really thinks it's quite a valid diagnosis, and it's developmental trauma. And that's from childhood, you know. So I had the double whammy, and it began with my very, very first like entheogenic, you know, therapeutic experience was a intramuscular DMT ketamine shot. Okay. So it's kind of like you're starting with the pinnacle right off the bat. Very few things reach that level, but it began what has now been a 15-year relationship with the medicines. But I primarily practiced ayahuasca for most of that time. Then I was introduced to ibogaine, and then I started working with ibogaine and 5-MeO through the clinical experience at Crossroads Treatment Center, and then the Ibogaine Institute, and then the Baja Ibogaine Center. That's where I was trained as a facilitator or a practitioner, and did many sessions over the course of, you know, the time that I worked at those 3 places. I also did intake, which is essentially taking people's extensive medical histories and screening them for whether or not they're safe to have entheogens of any sort. And there's a lot of contraindications and conflicting medical conditions. So I started off a hard convert. I you know, was very resistant to almost every form of therapy in the beginning. You know, I feel like if I had to self-diagnose, I'd say that I had, because of all of the developmental trauma, because of all the combination traumas, I had a mixture, and because of my family situation, I had, you know, borderline spectrum behavior with a lot of narcissism, and you know, I had deep insecurities, fears of abandonment, you know, the lack of nurturing. Plus, I was also really stressed out kid and a youngster, so I had a lot of stress disorders long before I had PTSD. And over time, I was able to not only embrace the healing path I was on, but like I became a legitimate spiritual convert. I think like most people, I came from what I felt was like a rather bourgeois intellectual tradition. I went to a great university. I had the privilege of going to a really good preparatory academy. And like all really intelligent people of that ilk, we all flirt with, some form of agnosticism to atheism at some point when we're able to really see through the transparency of, the organized religion, Leviathan, as it were, right? So I went through that phase as a youngster, and I was, into the whole existential thing, and, didn't believe that God existed and thought it was, rather facile and ignorant to embrace such beliefs. But once you drink ayahuasca, once you have 5-MeO DMT, 5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine, which comes from the Colorado desert toad or the Sonoran desert toad, the Colorado river toad. Warts on the back, squeeze them, scrape them, vaporize them. Yeah. Somebody thought that up, but once you do that, I don't know of any other rational mental way of explaining this is a transcendent experience. This is pure epistemology. This is like God. This is a direct experience of the oneness, or, in near-death experiences, often you hear people describe the tunnel of white light, and the feeling of the out-of-body experience, the disembodied sense of the ego or being trapped in the nothing. And much of that 5-MeO experience is like that. We can get back to that later, but I'm mentioning it in the sense that at some point, the tryptamines and tryptamine therapy, and for those who don't know, there's kind of two classes of drugs. There's tryptamines and phenethylamines, right? Phenethylamines are derived from mescaline and the cactus plant, and ultimately all the amphetamines and all of the alphabet drugs, the Shulgin drugs, as it were, those all kind of spin off of the phenethylamine tree. And then the tryptamine tree are much more larger complex molecules, but they include harmalines like ibogaine, dimethyltryptamine, bufotein, 5-MeO DMT, and psilocybin from mushrooms, right? Mm-hmm. And so those are the hardcore entheogens. And I started working with those, and I feel like I was able to have a sense of legitimate and real healing. And I mean like catharsis and release of the previous traumas, processing of it on a psycho-spiritual and on a emotional, intellectual level, forgiveness, letting go, like by any definition of either medical or spiritual healing, like these medicines allowed this to happen. They didn't do it on their own. And there was a lot to do. So I had to, be able to, pick and choose like buffet style from all these different types of modalities.
Yeah.
But as you may remember from the Future Fossils podcast, everything was going great, and then until it wasn't, and I hit that midlife crisis, and had what I have described as like, I don't like calling it a nervous breakdown, but let's just call it a collapse, a breakdown of sorts, an overload. What happens is that as if you have a traumatized physiology, your nervous system isn't firing that great to begin with. Your prefrontal cortex is, shrunk. It has a very difficult time reacting and processing alarm, additional traumas, and especially stress. It's shrunk because of the cortisol, right? Yeah. And when you're overloaded and in that condition, and I had a number of things happen over a short period of time, including a great many people close to me died in either unexpected ways or took their own life, including my sister. And I went into all of that in pretty great detail in that previous podcast, and we can talk about that stuff tonight if you'd like. But it and the pressures I put on myself professionally and socially was really too much. And
how many years into the entheogenic path were you when that happened?
10.
10.
Yeah.
Okay, can I just dial us back a little bit?
Yes.
Okay, so I got a lot of things I'm curious about. One is when you started looking at this stuff as, you know, viable modalities, potential modalities for the trauma, did you even have to buy into the trauma? Did you have to gradually come to believe that Charles Shaw suffers from PTSD? Were you resistant to that?
I was never resistant to it. I was shocked when my therapist at the time, and this was in the early 2000s. So just quick on the chronology scale, I graduated from college in '92 with a crack addiction, which I got when my family essentially collapsed and went bankrupt, and like all of the whatever moorings and whatever grounding and whatever I knew as stability and my family and my life and my home, it all disappeared. My response to it was to develop a pretty nasty addiction over it. In particular stimulants, like the minute I connected with them for the first time, it was as if they were made for me. And what I come to find later is that people with the mix of conditions that I had, which includes childhood abuse, developmental trauma, and then PTSD, and also have other stress conditions like I had, which are essentially epigenetics. So my mother was super stressed out. In her womb, I was bathed in cortisol.
Yeah.
And I was born a stressed out baby and lived a stressed out life with a shrunken hippocampus and all that stuff. And then the first time, I never really had any dopamine flowing through me. Like I didn't experience pleasure or joy as a child. I was always stressed out. And the first time I get a big dump of dopamine, it's, you know, game over, man. Like get me more and get me all of it and get it to me right now. So it became a long struggle for me. And by 2001, though, I had kicked the crack part of it, you know, and I kicked it cold turkey, and I did it essentially by joining a dojo and studying martial arts, and just by like iron will of commitment. I had already about 10 years of exposure to 12-step recovery, so I'd, you know, been in and out of all of that. And I, you know, had done all the steps, at least as many as I could, under usual conditions. I had gone to rehab. Like I knew enough, and I had enough of a sheer force of will, sheer determination and ambition that I quit. But I was a mess. And less than 6 months after I quit, I found myself, I owed these gangsters, these gangbangers that I got my drugs from in Chicago. I owed them a lot of money. And one night they found me, and I was getting a pretty serious beating for my life. But I was also had been training for, you know, well over 6 months at this dojo. And I, you know, I always carried weapons on me, and I had a knife on me that night. And when the opportune moment arose, I was able to essentially stab and disable 2 of the guys, you know, and one of them I hurt really, really bad. And, you know, it's all theoretical when you're training, when you're studying fighting, or when you're, you know, doing all this, but when you're in the moment and your life's on the line, that's what really determines, I hate to put it in these terms, Piers, but the wolves from the sheep, or, you know, those who will survive and those who wouldn't survive, those who would freeze in that moment. And I found out that I was somebody that didn't freeze, that I could act. But just like they don't tell the kids that join the military, you never know what it's like to severely hurt or almost take someone's life until you do it. And the scream that this kid let out haunted me for years. And I mean, I had vicious flashbacks to that scream for years. And I was on high alert for years. A couple months after that, I was in New York City reporting on the 1-year anniversary of 9/11. And I was, the ground zero ceremony and all of that stuff. And I went out with some friends and we got drunk at Cafe Wa, and we're walking down the street, and I wandered into the intersection and almost got hit by a car. And there were a group of Latino men in the car, and it triggered something in my memory of my relationship with these gangster disciples in Chicago and these Latin kings. And I went after this car. I was ready to fight like 6 dudes in the middle of New York City, That's when I knew something was wrong. And I had been working with a therapist in Chicago just, for a few years, and a gentleman named Tom Goforth, and he's retired now. But when I told him that story and what had happened, and that I couldn't sleep, and I described all of my symptoms of hypervigilance and of what my dog does. I have a blue tick coonhound with some chow in her, and she's a tracker, and she's got some of the most amazing motion, action, and tracking ability I've ever seen. So she's totally motion activated by anything in her vision. The same thing was happening to me. I couldn't look you in the eye or keep my eyes or my attention on any one thing, because I was constantly my attention was being drawn off in high alert everywhere. And I lived in that state for a number of years.
Yeah.
Up until about, it was 2005, I'm sorry, that I had that first experience that I described for you. So yes,
No, go ahead. Well, it's interesting because I belong to this group of people. I mean, there's just a lot of people like me, right? So when I listen to you, especially when I listen to the Future Fossils, mom, childhood, complex PTSD, all of that, we're kind of an age. I'm a little older than you. And then I do the whole 12-step thing, but we're like hardcore big book thumpers, we do all that. And it was only after I'd been in recovery for, I don't know, a long time, over a decade. And I know a lot of guys like me, and we kind of come out of this man up school of everything. We mistake the map for the territory around the 12 steps and all that. And it's only when you reach a certain age or some bad things happen to you that, in my case, frankly, part of it was my wife. She heard me say this sort of stereotypical thing like, I didn't have that bad of a childhood. And she was like, what the fuck are you lying about? And then the other thing was I started noticing that, I got bad startle response. I got a constricted range of motion. And so there's a lot of people I think that are actually like me. And this is how they're different from you, in that we do all this recovery stuff, but this living with trauma becomes almost this, I don't know, it becomes normative in some weird way. And the only thing you can do to meet it is you can kind of take some tough guy thing and mix it together with spirituality, but you don't go anywhere. Yeah.
I mean, spiritual bypassing is a big problem in recovery and in our culture in general.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, my 50-cent analysis is to say that, okay, so, here we have a traditional model, and they say, okay, well, you're not a moral failure or anything. You're not a bad person. You just have a disease, and you're always going to have this disease, and you're never going to get rid of it. And it's chronic, it's progressive. And the only way that you can remediate it in any way is to not drink or not use, and to go to these meetings every day and work these steps. And if you work them vigorously and you stay clean, maybe someday you'll have a spiritual awakening. And then, you'll be able to pass the message on. And that was not a very effective method. And, the stats pretty much back it up. I think it's got a 95% failure rate over 5 years, and you got less than 2 million people in the entire world that are, regular adherents to this program. And it never worked. And so then, you come to find all of these other things out. So me personally, I'm a harm reductionist. And I'm in the camp that believes that substance use disorder is a neurological disorder and that it's largely cognitive. I do not believe in the addiction gene. I do not believe it is a disease.
No, I don't believe it either. Yeah.
And, it is, there is a huge epigenetic component, but that's different from saying there is an addiction gene. That's a whole nother ballgame.
So
that's a one size fits all.
Break that down for the audience.
Okay. So if you're saying that addiction is a disease, okay, a disease is something that, first of all, you catch or that you have endogenous conditions for, and it's also something that you can treat prophylactically, okay? It has a cure, okay, or it's fatal. Now, what happens, and to say that there's an addiction gene, which means that you roll the dice and you're born with it, or if your parents got it, you're going to get it. That means that everybody is going to respond to the same way if they got the addiction gene. Okay. But epigenetics just tweaks that a little bit, and they say, no, I mean, let's really get down to what Darwin was talking about with genetics. It's not about survival of the fittest. It's about natural selection, and it's about genetic adaptation. So epigenetics answers the question of how do variables in generations show up in the following generation. In other words, like I said before, if you've got a stressed out mother, you're going to have a baby that is bathed in cortisol and stress hormones, and it's going to have stress issues when it grows up, and it's more than likely going to choose substances to self-medicate, okay? That isn't an addiction gene, okay, which is a one-size-fits-all. That's this person's specific set of circumstances handed down from their families based on their environmental situation, okay? It wasn't a random roll of the dice. It was something that they adjust to. But you take my generation now, you take me out of that stress, you teach me coping skills, and you put me in recovery. When I have a child, if my child isn't bathed in the same stress hormones, if it grows or nurtures or otherwise develops under different circumstances or different conditions, then the argument follows that those symptoms, those predilections, will have worked themselves out. They won't show up there. They won't be necessary anymore. So this is to argue that a gene and an addiction gene in your family would essentially say you're condemned to it, and I'm arguing that you're not condemned to it. This also expands the reach of substance use to everybody, because once you remove this kind of like highly specific criterion and you say, okay, well, you need to have a gene in order to have this because it's a disease. Well, now if it becomes more of a cognitive disorder, you start to put it on the spectrum like they do in harm reduction, and you start to look at it as a natural human response. Okay. Right. So 12-step recovery and the abstinence-based recovery and the disease model, the Jelinek model, essentially, which is very controversial. E.M. Jelinek was the one who first presented the disease model in the early 20th century. And as far as the, institutional understanding, it was very important. And it was a watershed moment where, officially speaking, it stopped being looked at as a moral failing and started being looked at as a health issue, which is what it is. However, the only viable recovery program was very, very strongly Christian-based, and it was the Oxford Group. And that was what Dr. Bob and Bill W. and Ebby pulled from to create the big book. Right? It was almost all coming out of the Oxford group.
Mm-hmm.
And what it did was present something that if you read it now, even though it kind of talks about it not being a moral failing, what you do is a moral inventory, and you do a lot of kind of Christian forgiveness and penitence actions, like making a list of those that you have, wronged, going and making amends wherever possible. These things are, based in almost every spiritual tradition, but they're really kind of rooted in the penitent Christian tradition. Okay. But what this did was it gave us a different dialogue, and it said, okay, listen, we're not supposed to really punish these people. We're supposed to treat them, with compassion and sympathy. But it took most of the century for us to really get there compassionately. It took until it really infiltrated almost every family that people started to really become more compassionate about substance use disorder. However, like once you expand it, once you start to realize that this is a normal human behavior. In fact, one of the preeminent addiction specialists in American history, I would argue, Ronald Siegel, who was Carter's advisor, who was the psychiatrist to the stars in Hollywood, and was he's on the faculty of UCLA Medical School, and he wrote a book called Intoxication: The Universal Drive for Mind-Altering Substances. Okay, and in it he argued that we can consider altering our consciousness a fourth primal drive behind food, sleep, and procreation. Okay, so it's hardwired into our neurology. There was a bird that just landed on my screen door and gave me a little holler, so I'm just kind of taking a peek at it. So he, Siegel argues that it's a pretty simple, connection that we evolved over 40,000 years by observing animals and seeing what they would eat and what their reactions or their behaviors were subsequently. So they would watch monkeys or elephants eat fermented fruit and become intoxicated. They would watch reindeer and other animals eat mushrooms and, become intoxicated. So that one was a big eye opener for me, as was a book called Marc Lewis.
Biology of Desire.
Biology of Desire. Thank you.
Great book. Yeah, great book.
Yeah, the memory ain't what it used to be, Piers. So you gotta work with me a little bit here. The trauma shrinks your brain a little bit. The Biology of Desire was fascinating, and he's a neurologist, and he argued pretty succinctly that all of the different ways that we would categorize or classify addiction are kind of not entirely true, but it's really a mix of three things. There's a choice component to it. There's a self-medication component to it. And then there is what seems to be, this genetic or behavioral or some kind of other component to it. It meets three criterions, but it also, he argues that it's not chronic, it's not progressive, it's reversible, and that neuroplasticity proves that you can rewrite old patterns. This is also the fundamental basis of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, I was talking to Bruce Alexander just the other day.
Yes.
About this. I brought up Lewis, and I kind of thought Lewis was just sort of the more neurobiological version of Alexander's more social psychological thing. And Alexander actually had a bone to pick with Lewis. He felt that it was a little biologically reductive. He felt that it was a little talking educational theory and what brains do. And this is the kind of thing that, intellectuals quibble about. But he said, no, this is what persons do. This isn't what brains do. He says, this is what persons do in reaction to the same environment. Now that sounds like real hair splitting, but the more I listen to Alexander, I could kind of get that he just wanted to have a more humanistic emphasis, but I still think they fit together, as does Lewis. But
Yeah.
Alexander's sticking to his guns here.
Did you read The Globalization of Addiction?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I've been in dialogue with him for a long time.
Yeah. So, I mean, for the people that haven't out there, what he essentially does is he establishes a historical meta-narrative that argues that and also Ed Villamy, who's, he wrote a book called Mexica, which is about the border culture. He's a BBC, a Guardian journalist, well-known investigative reporter. He went and explored border culture between the United States and Mexico. And he makes the same argument, which is that the globalization, that drugs, that addiction, and the drug economy, they're all fundamental parts of globalization.
Yeah.
And that it's a necessary to have a kind of a despised underclass, right? And that the drugs are both kind of, like Homer Simpson said, to alcohol, the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. It's a kind of a Ouroboros, particularly, within what they would call the working classes or the developing world, or what have you. And so you've got, multi-billion-dollar transnational economies. It's no longer just a medical problem. It is a thing. It is a cultural phenomenon in and of itself, right?
Yeah.
And so Alexander, I feel like, really has to, kind of toe and make sure that there is constant connection to that argument. But what I took away from Lewis's book was that I didn't get that feeling at all. In fact, what I felt that he was specifically doing was trying to separate what the brain does versus what a person does and connect it. And what I recall was that he said that the brain is an almost perfect organ, right?
I remember that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and that what he says was what we call disorder or dysfunction, dysregulation or psychosis, perhaps, is at least within when it comes to addiction or substance use, is that the brain is actually acting perfectly as it was designed to.
I totally get that from him too. Yeah.
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 So flipping that script and realizing, okay, I'm not, because, I think I wrote Exile Nation, and I think I did the Exile Nation project largely out of this desperate need for people to, like, forgive me that I have lost myself to the drugs and all of the criminal activity that goes along with them. I'm a good person. I'm an educated man. Respect me, and I had all of that shit going on back then. I hadn't yet really stood on my own 2 feet, and I feel like a lot of it was apologia. I feel like it was a please, come on, give me a break. Let me make my case. Addicts are good people. We should be treated like this. And people put in prison for drug use are political prisoners. No, I still would make some value of that argument. But I needed to be okay with me, and I think that really colored my work for a number of years, because I really wasn't okay with myself. And certainly during those years, I was trying too hard, man, to put it mildly. So there was this other component to it.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Yes.
No, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I mean, some of my takeaways from Exile Nation was, here's this guy, white dude, educated, basically privileged, but, has a history, but, very easy for a reader like me to identify with.
Yeah.
And then you wind up in this carceral setting, and you have all these eye-opening experiences. Like when I remember you describing watching, I believe it was the trade towers in the day room with this black inmate, and suddenly something shifted, because the way he responded to that was he obviously wasn't buying the narrative.
Yes.
So one of the messages I was getting from the book, which I tend to agree with, is, sometimes you go in those places and you find people that are much more politically savvy because they've been on the wrong end of the stick the whole time.
Yeah.
And
that
so,
was the London bombing. Just
Beg
to
pardon?
be clear, it was the 7/7.
It was the early one. Okay. Yeah, I couldn't remember.
So it was 4 years after 9/11.
It was the British thing.
Yes, the London bombings. Yes.
Okay.
And so they blamed it on Al Qaeda, and one of the guys I was standing there with, his name was Frosty. He was about a 58-year-old African American gentleman at the time. He just shook his head and just said, "Ain't no fucking Al Qaeda."
Yeah.
You know?
So for me was, reading the book had that quality of, bright dude comes on hard times, gets a tour of the underworld, comes back with a tale to tell us. I mean, that's my memory of Exile Nation. And you're saying that there was some part of you that was, not that none of that was valid, but there was some part of you that was seeking a kind of redemption through that.
Yeah, because if you remember, there was 4 books. There are 4 parts in the book. And the 3 parts that took place in the Illinois prison system were essentially one story. But what I did was then I added a 4th section, which was my biography, which in hindsight, I think was, I don't know. I'm really ambivalent about it, because my reasoning in the beginning, and the book opens and closes on the same day in the same moment, which is me in the courtroom about to go off to prison. But it's from 2 different sides of the door. So in the opening of the book, I'm on the other side of the door, on my way to prison, looking back out into the courtroom, and it winds me all the way back to the moment where I'm standing in the courtroom about to be sentenced, looking at that door behind the judge that they lead you off into, right? So it was all about that doorway as a kind of like on the nose symbolism about, change and, moving forward, and that every doorway is a portal to something new. But to get there, I had to tell the whole story of my life, and what I wanted to do was explain how I ended up in prison, how I ended up with these drug charges. So then it became this largely received narrative on my family history that was mostly from my mother. And then there was my version of, the formative events in my life that led to my addiction and ultimately led to my incarceration. Okay. And in hindsight now, after many more years of work, a lot of healing, and some pretty rigorous self-accountability, and having to really search my soul and get real with myself, there is a lot of victim narrative there. And I believe it was...
Wait, victim narrative in the book? Or
I believe my framing of my biography was very much a victim narrative, because I just kept pummeling people with the worst things that I had gone through and seen, which were pretty freaking heinous, from most people's perspective, especially if you'd never gone through that type of violence or abuse or seen the things that I had seen. And this was a lot of really hardcore sexual abuse going back to my childhood, and then, all of the different self-destructive things that happened, and all the different ways I died and was brought back to life, and yada, yada, yada. It was very sensationalistic. It was reflective. I was conscious enough to try to give my parents a good break, instead of trying to condemn either or, because they were both problematic in that old narrative. But I also remember really, really choosing my words carefully, and really structuring my arguments, and presenting a side of myself that was almost entirely sympathetic. And even when I would talk about some of the worst things I did, because when you're a crack addict, you do bad things. And,
yeah, I've done a little tour with the pipe myself.
And you'll steal anything that isn't nailed down, including limbs and organs and whatever. But I think in hindsight, I played a lot. I played up the victimhood in order to receive what I felt was the necessary sympathy, because I just felt like I was being dismissed as a as a drug addict. And more importantly, what loomed really far back in there was mortal terror that I might be perhaps mentally ill or just fucking batshit crazy, right? And that was a road that I had to confront. And I was in great denial about everything that had happened to me. I wanted to pretend that I was healed. I wanted to pretend that you can just drink some ayahuasca and everything's going to be fine, or you can go to Burning Man and express your true self and dress really cool and wear dreadlocks, and you know, find a beautiful girlfriend and run a, you know, famous group of people and have a lot of power. But that doesn't mean that you're healing, you know, and
Okay,
even when,
I just need some clarity. So
yeah,
you're saying that the narrative in Exile Nation, you were victimizing yourself, you were presenting you had a kind of imaginary audience, you were making a certain Charles Shaw play out there.
yeah, that the one in the book, it was not a real big asshole, and this guy, like, unfortunately, he was a real big fucking asshole.
Okay, so when you say you victimize yourself, you're trying to elicit sympathy.
Very much so.
Everybody likes a redemption narrative, yada, yada, yada.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny, a couple of someone on my Amazon book page actually kind of called that out and said, like, although they accused me of fabricating the incidents in the book, which, you know, is not true. They all happened, but it was definitely very much like, oh, you know, you poor thing, like, you know, poor Charles, like everything happens to him. And I think it sat with me over the years. And, you know, you have to cut to like my early 40s, and I, like, you know, I did what every man lies awake at night terrified that they're going to do, which is to completely fuck up a really good life and fuck up everything that they ever wanted or ever dreamed of or ever desired. And I kind of went through that. And, you know, I lost, you know, the girl, and, you know, the status and the power and the position and, you know, the attention and the fans and all of that stuff that I had. I mean, even though I was some kind of low rent, you know, not non-celebrity, or just a kind of a Burning Man celebrity, whatever you wanted to call me, like, I still had a pretty nice life.
And you're saying this was all 5 years ago when you're
Well, this was 10 years ago and going into about 5 years ago. So in that 40 to 45 range, when everything started happening for me, and I should have embraced it, been grateful, and realized I had all of that, I didn't. And instead, you know, I still felt that I hadn't been validated, that I hadn't gotten proper acknowledgement. People didn't recognize my talent, my brilliance, whatever it was. I just wasn't there. And that made me really insecure, and that made me really narcissistic. And in hindsight, it ultimately brought about, you know, the disillusion of this person, and I would call it like the destruction of this person, this Charles Shaw, that, you know, this character that I had built up. And this was all because I had unresolved trauma, like serious developmental shit that I just decided to bypass. Okay, you might have thought I was rambling there, but we've come back, you know.
Yeah, no. This is where I wanted to get. So even though you'd been years into entheogens, psychedelic psychotherapy, you were still doing that. You were still deceiving yourself, or whatever you want to call it.
Psychedelics can be seen like fractal, like a Mandelbrot, right? That constantly spinning off, but also like a stream, or like a river with eddies. Okay, so you can get, and also to follow up on what, you know, we were talking about the new model, like add harm reduction, add fourth primal drive to neuroplasticity, and this idea that entheogens can do the exact opposite of the 12-step program, which is, instead of, you know, working all the steps, staying sober for many years, going to all these meetings, and then you eventually might have a spiritual awakening. No, entheogens will give it to you immediately, and then your job is to figure out how to integrate the fact that you just had a spiritually life-changing experience, an experience of oneness, an experience of divine, of God, whatever you want to call it, but you've had it and you're never the same afterwards, okay? So that is a lot of truth. But to follow that truth, it means acknowledging the darkness, the shadow. Like you have to, in order to be free, you have to let go of the chains that are holding you. And in developmental trauma, especially with severe childhood abuse, substance abuse, and I use this in the proper term, the retardation of development that goes along with substance use and all of that, the shadow becomes, like those pictures of those trains in India where there's like hundreds of people all clamoring on the side of it. Like your shadow becomes like that overcrowded, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't deal with it properly, it takes over and it forms into things like severe narcissism, And so add on top of that a psychedelic community and people that are well known as visionary artists and psychedelic writers, the people I used to hang out with, the Daniel Pinchbecks and the Andrew Joneses and all this, and these are like my homies, and like we're all, in this world where we, kind of thought we were like super special and everything. And, one of the like most, I think, common but least understood and least discussed side effects of psychedelic use or psychedelic therapy is the way that it can double you back into one of these eddies of pretty extreme narcissism, megalomania, or a messianic complex. And so while I'm watching all the people around, I'm watching Pinchbeck and my buddy Mitch Schultz, who made this movie DMT, The Spirit Molecule, and he's hanging out with Rogan, and they're all doing ayahuasca. And then there's Android and his wife at the time, Phaedra, and they're all doing hella ayahuasca, and they're taking tons of LSD, and they're taking pretty much anything they can get their hands on. And the egos of all of these people in this circle, became ridiculously overinflated. Mine
I've had a run-in with a couple of them.
Mine included. And we really thought our shit didn't stink, and that many of them literally did think they were here to save or change or otherwise.
Well, I got to tell you, from where I sit, and maybe I'll disclose a bit, but from where I sit, I felt like I was watching the 1960s Redux, meaning, it was Leary and company all over again. Maybe they're a little more sophisticated about, digesting Stan Groff and this and that, but basically it was that same kind of crazy enthusiasm that was just, And so I'm going to push back just a little bit on you.
Right on.
So I am one of these 12-stepper guys, right? I'm a junkie. I'm a little different from you. I smoke a lot of crack, but I like going downtown. I like my dope. I like my booze. I'm all that. And I hated AA. I'm treatment resistant like you. And then this guy, I don't know if you ever heard of him, but there was this famous 12-stepper, this old felon named Don Pritz got a hold of me. And I had this experience, right? And I stopped thinking about getting high. I actually do have spiritual experiences. But like I said, years go down the road, and I do realize that, if the trauma is, as a child, driving me up into my head to try to manage it, and then I hang out in my head for a little while and I don't like that shit, and I discover drugs, disembodiment, and I gradually realized that once I got into this 12-step thing, I had certain experiences. I was different, but I kept using spirituality to keep, you called it bypassing. I think of it more in terms of just disembodiment. And I think there are a lot of, why your work and your biography is so compelling to me is there's a lot of people like me. We're a little tribe. People who've gotten to a certain age and they've worked pretty hard and they've gone to the dojin and they've done this and they do their yoga, but they're hitting these kind of walls, right? And then there's the psychedelic world. And then there's this little narrow band of people, and there's this one woman in particular, I won't name her, but she really fucks me up because she got this total trauma history, not an addict, but bad trauma history. And she wound up doing this thing where they piggybacked the psilocybin on top of the MDMA, 3 sessions, and then
Called a hippie flip.
what's that?
Traditionally in rave culture, that was called a hippie flip.
Well, then the last session, they hit her with the toad on top of it.
Oh, wait, at the same time that she was doing
And she
psilocybin MDMA?
Yeah.
That's insane.
Well, here's the thing that fucks me up about it. The integration, you know, I've been around psychology and whatever forever. The integration between sessions made sense to me. I'm just waiting for the shoe to drop. So every time I talk to this woman or hear about her secondhand, the healing has been like nothing like I've ever heard of. We're talking about somebody who was ready to die, kill themselves. The therapist even said when she said, I'm gonna go do the psychedelic thing, she said, it'll probably put you over the edge. And she's like, I don't care. And now she's like, I've never seen healing like this. So yes. And the other thing about it is she, like a lot of us, you see, I think there's this weird thing going on now where trauma and spirituality are so linked that we've totally forgotten that in traditional cultures, that shit was just chopping wood and carrying water. You didn't have to go through combat or alcoholism to find spirit. It was woven into, you know what I mean? That there's possible to do spirituality in the absence of trauma, in at least intact indigenous cultures. And she's somebody who chased healing prior to this for a good part of her life through spirituality, like I did, had these pretty powerful experiences, but none of it really, you know, she's still left with this unresolved trauma. And so, you know, I'm listening.
That's her state now?
No. Now she's done the entheogen thing, and her healing's like nothing I've ever seen.
Right.
And I'm sitting here going, it fucking didn't happen to me. You know, I feel like I glimpsed all these crazy things, you know, pink river dolphins and anacondas and you name it, but I don't feel like my trauma heals.
Okay, question. When you said, just to clarify for me, when you said that you said she did 5-MeO on top of psilocybin and MDMA, do you mean that all at once, like all three medicines at the same time? She was
on the MDMA, the psilocybin, and then she did the toad on top of that, on the third session.
Okay, so but on top of it, meaning that she was under the influence of the other two. Yes. Okay, so that is, unfortunately, that's nothing that I would ever do or recommend, and that's because
I'm not signing up for it, but
well, just because psilocybin and 5-MeO are both tryptamines, and they're both harmalines, are in the same family, and you essentially you can't have them too close together because it could essentially kill you. Okay, it's a risk that we don't take. We always space them out if you're going to have anything in the same family. That's why you never mix ayahuasca and ibogaine or ayahuasca and 5-MeO. So it's interesting that happened. Now, I know of plenty of circumstances where things like that happen too. I think what it speaks to is it goes back to the traditional idea, and this is just the most kind of pedantic and mundane, but it's the truth, man. Is that if you're not ready, if you're not really ready, if you're not bottomed out and willing to do whatever it takes, then your entheogen journey is going to be longer, and it's going to take some time. I drank ayahuasca for 13 out of 15 years that I work with entheogens, and it was only the beginning and the end that really did any work for me. And everything in between was, I thought I would argue a waste of time. But everything was building upon the previous work, even if it was sub-perceptual.
So real quick, all that time in between still was doing something all the times in between, or could you have done without that?
No, I couldn't have done without it, because when I reflect on it, I see that, well, maybe it wasn't, dealing with like the biggest issues. Maybe it didn't prevent me at the time from becoming a narcissistic jackass or from screwing my life up and losing everything I had, you know, but in a certain hindsight and reflection, I can see that as part of the process. But hold on just a second. I'm sorry. Somebody just came in the door. Remind me where I was again, and then can we edit this
Well, we're
out?
talking about whether or not the healing happens.
Oh,
I mean,
okay. I remember.
Also, we've got a few things going on here. We got one, you talking about the narcissism, the people getting lost in kind of an entheogenic narcissism. You've got people doing the stuff and not much is really happening. And then we've got the third category of like undeniable healing.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess what I was saying in that regard is that it wasn't when I was really ready to do the few things that don't involve entheogens, but are part and parcel of how and what message it transmits to you, which is essentially about your healing. Okay. So like, I guess the easiest way to say that is until I was willing to look in the mirror, like totally and completely, and I was done being the person that I had been. I finally just hit a certain wall, and it wasn't that long ago. It was maybe when I was 48, so about 2 years ago, after a few years of just really, really hard times and not really knowing if I was going to make it back to myself or have any type of stable life again. You know, some things happened, and you know, another one of these hopeful situations that I picked myself up and moved cross country for ended up not working out, and it ended up being a bad situation. And it triggered a really, really deep traumatic response. I would call it like one of those major flight responses where you pack everything up and you take off and you don't really know where you're going or what you're going to do. You're just running. And I found myself in that position again. I found myself in that position a few too many times in this 5-year period in particular, but also across the whole spectrum where I'd really been dealing with severe trauma. So this is like a 20-year journey of this flight instinct kicking in and really just like messing my life up, like really, really messing it up. Like once again, have no idea where I'm going, have no idea how I'm gonna get there, how I'm going to take care of myself, how I'm going to work, like where I'm going to live. I show up on people's doorsteps. I, you know, put out calls for help, all of this stuff that was, you know, like this ongoing pathology, this behavior that, you know, for some reason, I guess I was just still like blind to is the only way I can put it. Or that, as I would come, this is like the third time I splashed myself in the eye drinking this tea. What I suddenly understood was that there was something in the flight response I didn't understand, and what was killing me and what drove me back to substance abuse a few years earlier was that I was under so much stress. My brain was so bathed in cortisol that I didn't know that the flight response, the cortisol dump, and the high alert of the trauma trigger meant that your higher functions were shut off, that you could try all day long to solve your problem or figure out a solution to something, but you weren't going to be able to do it. And so what I would do is I'd be in these positions, and then I would be like, okay, I got to solve my way out of this. I got to figure out a solution. And I couldn't think. And it would just, I mean, I literally could not think, couldn't form.
So you would just run.
I would run and then I would shut down. And the last time that I did, it was so destructive to me that I had to do something else, or else I wasn't going to survive again. And I just knew it. I just knew I had reached that point. I didn't have another collapse in me. Like I had to get my shit together. I had to. And I was tired of it too, man. I got to be honest with you. I was really upset with myself. By the way, this is my best friend in the whole world,
Oh,
lady.
hey, lady.
This
Hey,
is Bark.
beautiful.
Yes,
What's your name?
her name is Bark.
Marc.
but I use the French spelling. It's Barque. And
She's
this
gorgeous.
dog taught me a lot about healing too. But yeah, so this was a turning point. I mean, this was when I did things that I had never done before, and the reason that I'm kind of taking us here is to say that all that work in between. You asked, was it worth it or was it not worth it? Yeah, it was worth it, because all of that allowed me to, instead of doubling back into this self-destructive eddy, like even though I had started onto it, I was able to pull myself out of it, instead of it being a whole, year or more or whatever to try to like get my life back together. I pulled my shit together within a couple of months. And I was able to get back out to the West Coast and kind of start my life over. But this was only after I got real with myself. And that was really hard. And that was a process that I was only able to do because I had started and continued to soften my heart and grow my compassion and my empathy and my ability to reflect through the medicine work. But in particular, it was when I really started working with 5-MeO, and that was in 2016. And that once I worked with that medicine, I can't tell you how it works. I tell people it heals with love, because it, even like if you and I like were best friends and there was a rift between us and we couldn't talk to each other, it would take us to a place, the medicine would take me to a place where I would feel the love that I used to have for you again. And it would remind me, oh yeah, I love this guy. And it changes your perspective on the person. You heal through being able to forgive and let go. And love helps you forgive and let go. But once you go there, it's like you make a contract with whatever is there. I like to call it God, and I like to call it her. I think the big lady upstairs is kind of where I go with it. And that relationship that I had with her changed everything with me, because it started to have a dialogue with myself, or what I believe to be her. And I don't mean voices in my head. I mean like a internal monologue, an internal dialogue, which helped me to take different steps, to reach out to people that I respected and trusted as spiritual teachers, people that I knew would tell me what I needed to hear, not what I wanted to hear. And I listened to them, and I took their advice, and I started doing everything and anything I could to raise myself up, to conquer my pathologies, and in particular this flight, which was born out of my stress disorder and a very severe anxiety disorder, which panic attacks and all of that, and eating my fingers to bloody stumps throughout my entire life. I got rid of most of that. Like, I haven't had a panic attack since. I found an entirely different way to manage my stress. I feel differently. I crossed some kind of spiritual Rubicon that I can't turn back from. And now I've managed, and this is the result of 15 years of medicine work and all of that in between, even those, years that I lost in the shadow. They were still all part of the work. And what it's created now is the awakened version of myself, which is, and I say that like with humility, because I think I'm a humble dude now, because I've had my ass kicked like completely. I'm very grateful for what I have. And now it sounds really funny, Piers. I don't mean to sound like trite, but like I'm a Pisces, I'm a double water sign. And now I've been working in this deep compassion medicine that I'm trying to learn how to live now as somebody that is able to feel and absorb like the full spectrum of emotions. I was somebody who just had to run away from the intensity and extremes of my emotions throughout my life. Now I live with them, and I learn how to live with them and let them sometimes overwhelm me like a tidal wave, especially grief and sadness. Like I cry like a baby these days, but at the drop of a hat, and this is something I couldn't do for a good chunk of my life. So and that person is somebody that I love that guy. Like I love this guy, you know? And that in loving myself is also accepting like all of my insanity and realizing that like I really, man, I was out there for a few years and I really, really went nuts and I was a drowning man. And I don't blame people for scattering when they did, you know? But sitting on the side of it where I am now, I mean, dude, the lockdown, like I'm one of the 48 million unemployed right now. Like I haven't been able to do any of my work. My medicine is stuck on another continent. You know, like I'm, you know, in a transition of housing and like things are rough, but I'm happy. I'm with someone I love. I got a dog. We have, you know, a very simple but really rewarding life. Watch a lot of movies. We like to grow things. You know, we like to help our friends, spend time with grandkids, and it's like it's a simple life, devoid of the ambition, the persona of Charles Shaw, author, filmmaker, activist, you know, blah 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 blah. Like that guy was, you know, like that guy was an albatross in a lot of ways. Now, this is not to say that like, you know, I don't want to like, you know, totally, you know, eat shit on camera here in the sense that I'd like to think that I contributed, you know, I'm proud of my work.
Should be.
You know, I didn't win any Oscars. I didn't get rich, but I'm proud of what I did. But I also see its flaws now in a way that I've never been able to before. And that's because I've been able to see and kind of accept the flaws in me. And, you know, just in time, because like crossing 50 was a trip. I'm still freaking out. I still don't really grok it. Oh man, 50. Like I am officially a fucking dirty old man, you know?
Hey, go get me a glass of water, young fella.
Right.
I'll tell you about 60 in a couple of years. All right. Well, a couple things before we wind up. I'd just like to talk about that. You mentioned it, really provocative, really interesting. When you talk about the way trauma can evolve into narcissism, can you break the dynamic of that down a little bit?
Oh, for sure. So what I understand is that so you have overlapping personality disorders. You know, you got borderline, narcissism, and antisocial, and they're all overlapping, right? So they all share narcissistic traits. The narcissistic spectrum tends to pop up in certain circumstances. One of the most popular ones is Trump and everything that he represents, which is that you were spoiled materially, but you had emotionally remote or unavailable parents. That was my deal too. Okay, so we had a lot of material comfort, but it was incredibly abusive and there was no nurturing and there was no love there. So love becomes transactional, and because one isn't nurtured and coddled and not coddled, I'm sorry, that's a really bad word, but nurtured, loved, cared for, and given a healthy sense of self-esteem by your parents, that need for validation and need for a self becomes like deeply externalized. Okay, so narcissism is about an unacknowledged or unmet need that is either because you got too much of or not enough of attention, right? There is also a form of narcissism that's where you just, you know, what they call like the millennial syndrome, where they were kind of enculturated to be completely self-obsessed, right? And then you've got the meta narrative, which is how in the 70s we kind of shifted from what I called the culture of civic responsibility to the culture of narcissism, and collective responsibility and our duty to our community and to our Constitution and to our flag and all that stuff, that morphed into loyalty to oneself, development of the self, development of one's individual identity, and then ultimately that became brand culture. Okay, so like narcissism exists on a spectrum, but this commonality is abuse, and this need, this pathological need, or we could call it a pathological inability to see anything outside the lens of one's own self-importance or relevance. And so, you know, in that spectrum, there's, you know, obviously attention-seeking behavior, but there's overt and covert narcissists. So you've got the overts are the one, you know, the selfie addicts, and you know, the people that I with everything that they talk about. That's overt narcissism. You know, look me, look at me, look at me, look at me. Trump's an overt narcissist, but he's also a malignant, toxic, pathological. He'll never get out of that. It's a largely not incurable, but it largely becomes pathological in people. You have to catch it before you get firmly entrenched in middle age. Generally, you got to start catching it in your 40s if you want any hope of like reforming it, right?
And covert?
And covert is when you a covert narcissist will get into a codependent relationship with an overt narcissist, and then their need for attention will be channeled with their overt narcissist partner as the shield or as the face of it. So they're able to feed their need for attention or self-inflated sense of self-importance or whatever through the behavior or the actions of the overt narcissist. So there are people that don't advertise, but still, when you talk to them or when you see their behavior, it's almost entirely self-interested, right? It's just they don't draw attention to themselves. Mm-hmm. But this now, because we have this culture that is so firmly rooted in individualism and the rugged individualism of the frontier and all of these tropes that make up American culture and what we have as our received history, and because of our economy, and because we need to keep people in a kind of a perpetual adolescence, and we need to keep them constantly updating their image and yada, 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 narcissism has kind of become de rigueur. So it has become a kind of a persistent and pernicious, almost all-encompassing pathology of almost everybody in our culture. I read a meme today that said that the reason that the United States has the highest amount of coronavirus cases is because we treasure and value individualism over collectivism, whereas the Asian cultures, the Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, all down the Pacific seaboard, locked down and all acted in a collective manner, and haven't had a fraction of the problem that we have. And in the United States, people's need to be an individual and to assert their rights and to flout the rules, right? Flout the rules is more important than another person's health, safety, or well-being. So that's why we got half the country that refuse to wear a mask and want to, you know, protest over.
So needless to say, getting worse out there. Addiction's getting worse, at least in this country. Yeah. All this social fabric is just rent, right?
Right. Yeah.
From your experience, how, I mean, I'm asking, you know, the $1 million question, but how do we, from what you've experienced, how do we start overcoming? How does even a group of people swim upstream? How do we form community?
Yeah, it's a great question.
You
know, especially especially the last part of it, because you know, going back to the Green Party and the anarchist collectives of the protest movement in the early aughts. I love the fact that we can say aughts, by the way. And then of course the Burning Man and the festival culture, which is, you know, it's all about community. And some people are actually building real communities and intentional communities, and then also studying in real intentional communities like Oroville and Tamara, and, you know, historical groups like Rajneeshpuram and such. You know, it's always the same things, and you know, the received wisdom is, you know, well, they always fail if it's intentional, because human nature always rises to the top, and human nature is acquisitional, and so somebody's going to want more than somebody else. Okay, so that's the kind of like meta narrative on the whole intentional community thing, which is, you know, one argument why all the commune movements fell apart, but then that's not taking into account active infiltration and destruction by government and other forces. So, you know, it was a much more complicated scenario going on. But at its core, what's going on now, in my personal opinion, is a regular changing of the order. Like, did you read The Fourth Turning?
Like, no, yeah.
Are you familiar with the book?
Yeah, familiar with it. Yeah, the concept.
Yeah, okay, so this is 2020. Like, Strauss and Howe argued, and what they did was they looked at 500 years of Anglo-American history, and they parsed out a regular 80-year cycle, a regular 80-year cycle that happens, broken into 4 20-year quarter cycles, right? And it's all about how a social order is first created out of destruction. So there's like the creation, and then there's like the height of that, and then there is the decline, and then there's the collapse, right? And every 20 to 25 years, there's a major war or depression or calamity, right? Without fail, across the board, 500 years of history. So pretty solid analysis. And what we are is right on time for one of these big, you know, what we called in the sustainable development community, massive change, right? It's like an actual thing, capital M, capital C, massive change. So it's when the systems completely turn over. It's the same thing that happened in the 1970s. There's like a massive cultural revolution. And I think we're having the same one again. There is a patriarchal, you know, Caucasian, largely Christian order that is ending. And Trump represents the last dying gasp of this bloated, patriarchal, oppressive white system. I hate to sound like a Marxist, but man, we are in late stage or end stage capitalism. I mean, we are essentially in what the economists would call the cannibalizing phase. Yeah, this is why you're getting like derivative markets and all this stuff.
Right. Speculating about absence and nothing. Yeah.
And then the demographics have changed tremendously. What you see in the streets over the last 3 weeks is the millennial and Zoomer generations coming of age. And there's 80 million millennials, and there's another like 40 odd million of these Zoomers, and they can vote now. And 2018 showed you the way that the Democrats swept so much, and I think they're going to completely change the face of the electorate in this country. And it's already happening, but they're also not just like voting, and they're, you know, they've been like, you know, dealing with not having work and coming of age with a lot of ideals that, just like back in the 60s, they're finding are a bunch of bullshit, and they're doing something about it. Except now you got 30 million empowered Black people, and you got 35 million empowered Latino Americans, and they're not having it. And it's time for this change to happen. So what people like you and I, and I only say this strictly demographically, because you and I are middle-aged, middle-class white males that are educated, and we are coming off the zenith of our power. where, and this is how I describe it, this is how I describe white privilege to people. I grew up believing that I had the right, and I have lived my life with the right that when I talk, people should listen to me. And I expect that when I talk, people will listen. And when I write a book, people will read it. And if I make a movie, people will see it. And I should have the opportunity to do all of these things. And the very fact that I think that way is exactly what we call white privilege, right? And just like the world economy shifted after the Cold War, or back in the late 60s when the economies that were offline for World War II came back online, you had these periods of complete structural change in the economic system, the financial system, and the social system. And we're having that now, and our ilk is losing its power. The women have taken their place. The minority cultures have firmly rooted their place. The non-binary and you know, kind of pan-gender movement for all LGBTQ rights, man, that's a firmly rooted thing. So you've got now these 5 or 6 different aspects of American culture as opposed to this titanic dominant culture and then everybody else scrambling around underneath it. So that's going to cause a lot of trauma. And not only that, but you're going to have, with this depression and the way that they're adapting to the outbreak by, you know, I mean, I read this week that Northwestern University is thinking of closing down. Northwestern University.
Really?
That the university itself is an obsolete institution, and that the coronavirus showed us that. So this stuff is big, and some people go with it and some people don't. And in these times, you get this regular pendulum swing of real hardcore nativism, reactionary thinking, authoritarianism, and outright fascism as people, as a minority, always a minority, tries to like hold on for dear life to the old system. And I think it's safe to say that the old system is done. I mean, I can't make an argument for it, and I see no reason, but it's bringing out the truth in people. Let me tell you, I just this week like had to let go of a couple of like people I never thought I would never be friends with again, because they are picking sides in this thing, and they're deciding that cops, Trumps, and martial law is a-okay, you know, and that you know, these protesters and these, you know, black folks and all this, they're all, you know, they need to obey the law, you know. And so what, you know, that you see 20 years of post 9/11 internalized authoritarianism coming to life in a lot of the culture. But you see the kids that grew up under that didn't really have it the same way. They didn't live through that Orwellian nightmare of 2002, 3, 4. You know, shit didn't break until Katrina happened, and all of a sudden people woke up and go, oh wow, the government's fucking totally incompetent. We thought that they were everywhere, you know, and they are now. But I think ultimately, from a spiritual perspective, you would hear people talk about this during the 80s and 90s. They talk about human potential. They talk about New Age. They talk about training people for the transition. And then there was the whole 2012 phenomenon. But what all of these had in common was that there was this dawning of the age of Aquarius type of cosmic psycho-spiritual meta shift. You know, like a big old change of program coming. And all of the things that we've seen have been the harbingers of this change. Each of these movements, starting with Me Too, since Trump got in, starting with the movement that put Trump in office, and then following with everything, every counter movement that's come with it. That's all part of this end game. People like us, we need to be planning for the future. We need to be on our shit, and we need to be working out our particulars so that we can be there to receive these people as they come in by the boatload, suffering from all of the various 5 stages of grief and some pretty severe trauma, as they're watching their world collapse around them, you know, and they worry about what's going to happen to their children and their grandchildren, and these angry young people who have every right to be angry, and they have every right to rip down these statues, in my personal opinion. And I come from the school of thought that if it don't work, tear it down and build a new one, you know? And I think that history has shown that happens, and all empires collapse. And brother, the time is now, you know? And so a lot of folks are just not taking it very well. And especially white men don't know how to back off. You know, they just don't know how to shut up and sit down and listen. So I think it's going to be harder for those people. Anybody who won't acknowledge that it's time to balance the scales, like nature and environment and conditions are forcing this to happen. We have no choice but to forcibly adjust course. I don't think a lot of people are going to make the transition. I think we're going to see unbelievable rates of substance abuse, of mental health disorders, of violent crime. Shootings are already going through the roof. So we're going through another one of those phases.
I expect that too.
Buckle up and get ready, but you know, it'll pass. Everything passes, you know. It's just the revolution means change, you know. Apocalypse at its core just means change, you know. So don't fear the apocalypse, you know, because there might be a brighter tomorrow in the corner. It's just not going to be one where, you know, you're going to be able to do whatever you want to do just because you think that you can. Like that phase of ontology, of human history, I think is coming to an end. We are starting to see now that individualism on this scale is a parasitical entity that will consume the planet. And this is not to say that we're about to be enslaved by the commies either, but collectivist thinking for global issues on the scale that we're dealing with is really the only way we're going to get through. So if it means that we have to be forcibly shift to start thinking and caring and acting in a way that is more considerate to others, hey, oh well, so be it, you know. I'm all for it.
Well, Mr. Shaw, that was great.
Thank you.
Maybe we should check in a year from now, see how things are.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
That would definitely be interesting. You know, the Spanish flu was a 2-year, you know, phenomenon.
Yeah.
It was 2.5 years before they really like stopped all of the waves stopped and all of the changes to life. And then after that, a lot of them are permanent, you know. This is going to be the same thing here.
Yeah, probably bigger.
But all this isolation, all this forced isolation is going to have a massive social cost. So that's just my prediction. An unbelievable one. All it takes is 90 days in solitary to drive someone completely mad. You know, so keep that in mind the next time we're forced into quarantine or whatever.
All right, brother. Let's I'm gonna call it an evening. I'll talk to you a little bit after.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds good.
Peace.